Hello, Garland Nixon here, and the death of NATO is upon us. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're going to talk about a little bit about the upcoming summit in Vilnius, and NATO, and what's happening with it, and where it's going, and why I think so. Um, Initially, what was NATO? NATO was ostensibly, allegedly, it was a defensive pact of nations. It was a bunch of nations who, oddly enough, interestingly enough, after the two wars in with Germany in in Europe, the countries, including Germany, determined that the country who had fought with the Allied forces against Germany and was most instrumental in defeating Germany was a greater threat, actually, than Germany. It was to me, there was a certain racial tinge. There was certainly a racial aspect to NATO, in that they saw the Russians as different. They saw them as Eurasians, the Slavs as, there was a certain racial aspect, where it was the Europeans, the Germans being part of the Western European group, saying we Europeans are concerned about the others getting us, and we must all join together to protect ourselves from the others. And of course, the Russians were considered part of the others. They were, if you look at Russia's, um, I would say their political, cultural philosophies align more with Asia, with Africa, and with Latin America, in that they're more traditional societies when it comes to, the whole family stuff, when it comes to differences and changes in society, when it comes to a more a foundation in their religious um, and cultural views of the world. I think that to some extent, if you look at Russia culturally, they actually, interestingly enough, they align more with Asian, African, Latin American. They align more with what's called the third world, what was economically referred to as third world, and global South, whatever you call it. They align more with them because they are a more um, conservative society. And I say conservative not in the politically conservative, more in the culturally conservative, which then blends into their politics, because politics are created, I believe, by culture, right? And that's why a lot of the woke stuff that doesn't go over well in the Middle East, it doesn't go over well in Africa, it doesn't go over well in Asia, it doesn't go over well in Latin America, and it doesn't go over, and you notice this, it doesn't go over well in Russia. And that's where you can see the cultural a perspective that aligns Russia more with the more traditional societies in the world. And Europe has a different cultural view. And I'm not here to judge anybody's. I'm a person that believes that everybody's culture is, we respect everybody's culture and allow them to do the things they want to do. And as long as they're not hitting you over the head, let them live their lives the way they choose, right? Culturally, I think intuitively, the Western Europeans recognized that the Russians did not culturally align with them well, and they saw them as others. And so NATO comes along. We're going to defend ourselves from the Russians. Well, the fact of the matter is, historically, it was the other way around. It was the fact that reality that the Western European countries traditionally attacked, came together and attacked the Russians. The Russians didn't come together and attack the Western European countries, right? They were not a colonial power. They didn't go to Africa. They didn't have this 1864 meeting. They weren't a part of it where we said we're going to split up Africa amongst the European and colonial powers. They weren't in all that stuff. They were just kind of, trying to make it on their own. Not judging good, bad, or indifferent. It is what it is. So the NATO to me was always a fraud. There was always a certain amount of a fakeness to it. It was kind of like the JCPOA, right? The nuclear agreement between the United States and Iran. When the Iranians have always said, we're not trying to create a nuclear weapon. We could if we want to, but we don't, so we won't. The CIA has and intelligence agencies have traditionally said, well, we don't see any evidence that Iran is trying to create a nuclear weapon. So the evidence that they're trying to create a nuclear weapon is not there. But you create a nuclear agreement to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon when even your own intelligence agencies say they're not trying to get one, right? So there's a level of falsehood to the nuclear agreement. The Iranians were willing to go along with it because they wanted to relief from U.S. sanctions. Now they have other options, so they don't really have to. BRICS, SCO, etc. So, like the JCPOA that was built on a falsehood that Iran was building nuclear weapons, I think NATO was erected on also on a falsehood, and that was that Russia was a threat, that Russia intended to attack Europe, and that Europe had to come together defensively to attack to stop Russia. When the fact of the matter was, historically, Europe had attacked Russia. Russia had not attacked Europe. So NATO was a fraud from day one. It was built on a falsehood. And then what it became was it became a number of things. Number one, it became a money laundering operation for the US empire so that the US could then dump all of its weapons on Europe. It could force Europe. They said everybody's got to spend 2% of their GDP on weapons. And most of those weapons were bought from the US. So the US was guaranteeing its 2% of the GDP of all of the European countries for the most part. Now there's, France builds a lot of stuff. A few countries here build things, but nothing as compared to, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, etc. So the U.S. it was a money laundering operation for the U.S. to extract wealth from Europe. Additionally, as I have said, that the EU was an umbrella organization that the U.S. put together so that they could bring all of its colonies and vassals in Europe together, so it could take charge of their cultural and economic policies with which it would use to extract wealth from them. In the same way, NATO was similar. It was just an umbrella organization so that it could bring together its colonies, and it didn't have to go out and talk to Denmark and go out and talk to Germany and talk to France. It could bring them all together and tell them, this is what I want you all to do, and this is how you want to do, how you are to do it. And they could all salute and say, yes, sir, which worked fine for the ruling elite, because they got a piece of the action. It never worked well for the people of Europe, but the people of Europe were under a false pretense. They were living under a falsehood that they had independence and sovereignty. And as long as the situation wasn't too desperate in Europe, wasn't difficult, and the US empire didn't feel threatened, they could continue to do that because there was no use for the US empire to pound them into the ground. So you've got a NATO built on a false pretense that, okay, we are here to protect ourselves, and in particular from Russia. Now, as the US empire got greedier and greedier and more desperate, more and more greedy and more desperate, they needed to extract more and more money. Also, as China, India, even Turkey and Russia arose economically, the competition for the countries in the global south that they were stealing all their money from, right, got greater. So now traditionally they just go steal the gold, steal the money, steal everything from Latin America, from Africa, Asia, wherever. So now Russia and China and other countries can come along and say, hey, we can offer you a business deal too, and we won't overthrow your government and kill your people and bomb you and occupy you with bases and things of that nature. So people started taking that. Actually, I met people are like, where are you? Oh my God, he's in a psych ward. Well, yeah, I should be so lucky. I'm too crazy for a psych ward. But no, actually, I'm at a conference room in my office. I'm at my office in Washington, D.C., K Street, around the corner, right, blocks from the White House. But I am it just slipped into a conference room real quick to do a show. So let me continue. And you notice no rubber rooms, no foam on the wall, so I won't bang my head, right? I'm actually in Jeffrey Epstein's old cell. How about that? Anyway, so let me continue. So um, historically, NATO was always a fraud. It was something, it was a tool for the US empire, and it became more and more of a tool for the US empire to extract wealth from Europe and to take full control of Europe's foreign policy. So at some point, the US decided that, okay, we're in a bad situation now. These other countries are starting to grow, particularly these other superpowers. And so now we have to knock these superpowers down. We've got to knock Russia down. We've got to knock China down. We have we have competition, and we want to be the world hegemon. So we're going to make our move, and we're going to start with Russia, and we're going to use our greatest tool, which is NATO, right? We're going to build our biggest proxy army, our most powerful proxy army ever, which we're going to need if we're going to go against Russia. We're going to build that on Russia's border in Ukraine, and voila, we're taking Russia down. This is going to work. What could possibly go wrong, right? So they put NATO together, they put Ukraine together, and they say, of course, come up with all of their lies, and they say, let's move. So they make their move. And bottom line is, it's flopped. It hasn't worked. It could have never worked. The truth of the matter is, the fact of the matter, here's the foundational problem that they have. They waited far too late, for number one. And even, I'll put it like this, even if Russia didn't have, Russia has something. Russia has something. Even if they didn't have the military might that they have now, Russia has something, and that is the will to fight. If you ever study self-defense, you'll find that that's very, very important. You have a person who doesn't want to fight, or a person who, for instance, you have a person and you're arguing over soda and you get in a fight. Okay, that's one thing. You have a person and their 2-year-old child is standing behind them, and you say, I'm going to kill that child. That's a fight you don't want. You know what I mean? Any parents here, you know what I mean? That person's going to kill you. They're going to bite your eyes out. They're going to scratch you. They're going to use every breath that they have to try to defeat you, because their child's behind. You ain't getting past that person easy. There's nothing that you can do. If they're alive, they're going to fight you to the death, right? You don't want that kind of a fight because of what. So that's what Russia has. That's what Russia has. Russia comes out and they say, my kids, my parents, everybody's behind me. The people that go out to fight for Russia say, you got to get through me to get to them. Even if they didn't have the military might that they have now, that's the kind of will to fight that they have. That's a fight you never want to get into. You don't want to pick that kind of fight, right? I don't care how well trained you are. You don't want that fight. You ain't coming away from it in a good situation. Even if you win that fight, you're going to be bitten, scratched, torn. It ain't going to be a good time, right? So, and the other thing about the Russians are this: they're very patient. There's a famous saying, beware the fury of a patient man. The Russian leadership, one thing I see about them is they have something, they use all of their tools. And I keep saying this over and over and over, and this is what a lot of people don't understand. Any weapon you have, use it. If time is your weapon, then use the weapon of time. And the leadership of Russia is willing to use time as a weapon. They're using to trade time for space. They war, as Andrei Martyanov always says, wars are won at the strategic level, not at the tactical level. And most people on both sides, on all sides, see the day-to-day tactics, but they don't think of the long-term strategy, right? And part of a long-term strategy has to be a willingness to make moves and see how they play out, to watch your adversary and see how they play out, to, if you see your adversary making mistakes, take your time and wait and let those mistakes manifest themselves on on the battlefield, right? And to see a battle from all aspects, to understand that this is a kinetic war in Ukraine, this is a diplomatic war in Africa and China and Asia, this is and Europe, this is an economic war when it comes to BRICS and the SEO, and to understand that all of these things got to play together, right? So the Russian leadership is using the weapon of time, and that can be very frustrating for those who would support their operation, who would say, we want you to move now, we want you to act now. What's taking so long? Well, what's taking so long is that time is a weapon, and that weapon will be utilized. So they're sitting there and you're watching your enemy beat himself to death. Why would you rush? Why would you rush? You're seeing NATO commit suicide in this. This people were like what they wanted was they wanted the Russians to come in with a massive army and stomp and just flatten Ukraine and stomp it into the ground, which they could have done. The Russian army is far powerful enough that they could have put together 800,000 people, fighters and everything, and brought their full. They've only used a small, tiny percentage of their military potential, particularly their air potential. But they could have came in and said, "We're coming in with everything we got, and we're going to stomp Ukraine into the ground." But if they had done that, um, the U.S. wouldn't have had time to blow up Nord Stream, would they? All these other things that happened, the things the things that have happened in Africa, the things that have happened in the Middle East, the things that have happened with China, these things wouldn't have had time to happen. So over the course of the year, last year and a half, roughly, a lot of things, all the things that have happened externally outside of the kinetic battle have benefited Russia's cause. So because they took their time, because they were in no rush, other things have aligned. There's a it's almost as if the universe aligned and said, yeah, you know what? We're gonna make this thing happen here. So here, we'll let this happen here and that happen there and this happen here. And because they were not in a rush, things have aligned in their behalf. And, not to mention, as the Iranians say, thank God for making my enemies fools. Well, they're up against the neocons. If you give the neocons enough time, they will screw themselves anyway. So what has happened is over the course of this last year and a half, through the other aspects of the of this war, many things have happened to benefit the cause of the Eurasian coalition, because again, this war is not really against Russia. This war is against modernity. It's against a multipolar world. It's against China, really, and it's against India, Africa, all these other countries that would push back against U.S. multipolarism. It is a mad empire saying we're falling. We're going to punch everybody. We're going to make everybody do what we have, what we tell them to do, and in that, you just anger more and more people. So I believe the Russians could move significantly stronger at any time that they want. And there's lots of people arguing they're going to have to do it. They need to move. They need to act now. They need to end this thing. And I think, things are going their way. Just wait. So now we're looking at a week. What is it? The 11th and 12th, something like that. I may have those dates wrong. 10th and 11th, 11th and 12th, something like that. In Vilnius, Lithuania, NATO's going to come together. And let's look at where they are right now. We're roughly a year and a half. Let's see, February, March, April, May, June. Roughly a year and 4 months into 4.5 months into the special military operation. And Europe has some significant problems. The fact of the matter is a lot of people in Europe are waking up to the reality that they're being deindustrialized, that the U.S. has, that the dynamics between being cut off from cheap Russian energy and the U.S. passing a number of laws to make it easier to provide tax breaks for countries and industries to move to the U.S., they got to realize that people are starting to realize the U.S. is simply stealing our industry, stealing our jobs, stealing our business, right? Europe is becoming unstable because it's being impoverished. All of those things together, particularly the energy costs, are making Europe a much less affluent part of the world. And it used to be a very affluent part of the world, but it's becoming much less affluent. And the bottom line is this: the Europeans benefited from clinging on to the U.S. empire, but they thought they were holding on to the empire, winning instead, and they were getting, as my buddy used to say when we went to the bar back in the, in the day, you shake the tree, I'll rake the leaves, right? It was, bring some girls around and we'll all meet them. Some guy can meet a little crowd of girls, bring them around, and me and my buddies all have somebody to meet, talk to, right? We're young guys at the bar. I like to use the old, when I was in my 20s at the bars, good analogies, right? And it was fun times, right? So at any rate, so that's what they were doing. U.S. empire, you shake the tree, we'll rake the leaves. You make the money, we'll get some. France could still be a colonial power. They could be in Africa. They could steal all the gold from the Africans, and they could use the AFRICOM, and they could use U.S. Intelligence assets to keep these Africans in line so they could keep stealing their stuff. Everything was working out well. Well, now the reality is, The U.S. is desperate, so it's treating the Europeans like it treated the Africans, the Latin Americans, and the Mideasterners. Now it's their turn. Now it's their turn to be robbed, deindustrialized, and have their clocks cleaned, and they're not happy about that. And might I add, the U.S. revealed this reality that basically they said NATO, this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that we're supposed to defend and protect Europe. Yeah, we're going on the offensive. We're going over to Asia, and we're going against China. And Europe, any European with half a brains, like particularly leadership, the business people are like, these are our number one trading partners. It's hurting bad for us to not get Russian energy. You cut us off from China, we're impoverished. You cut us off from China, we have no business, we have no industry, we have nothing, we have nobody to sell to, we have nobody to buy from. We got nothing. It's over, game set match for us. So Macron has already kind of started the veto process of stopping NATO from extending into the Pacific, extending the Atlantic all the way to cover the Pacific, since that makes. And to me, that's the beginning of the end of NATO, because NATO is a U.S. proxy organization, but it's only good until it starts to say no. I mean, the U.S. is a narcissistic empire. And there's an old saying about narcissism. If you want to know if somebody's a narcissist, tell them no. Narcissists can't stand the word no because they feel entitled to everyone and nobody can tell them no. And as NATO, and the narcissist knows this, if you have a person that you control, right? If it's your significant other and you control their money and control this, and you tell, go here and do this, and they say yes, go here and do that, and they say yes. The minute they say no one time, they're starting to stand up to you. And now your grip on power is starting to go. Once they say no once, their spine they start exercising the no muscle. And once they start exercising the no muscle, it gets stronger. So as now that France is like, nah, this NATO and Japan and going after, yeah, we don't want to do that. Now you have a problem because they're saying no, and other countries are going to say no. Not that I'm here by any stretch of the imagination standing up for Macron, but I'm just saying from the perspective of NATO, France does have a history where de Gaulle, tossed NATO, and of course the U.S. tried to overthrow the government. So there's a history in France. What you're going to see is more countries follow suit. They're going to Vilnius, and what do they have, man? What do they have? There are people saying, well, they're going to go there and they're going to say, we've decided to jump in and we're going to fight Ukraine. And to which I say, well, that sounds good. But if you look at it from the perspective of military hardware and personnel, with what? You know what I mean? They could want to fight Ukraine. They got nothing. They don't have the personnel. What is recently the Brits have admitted that they got 40 tanks. You're going up against the Russian army with 40 tanks. The Germans have said we don't have the military potential to defend our country from an attacker, meaning Russia. So you've got the two of the supposedly most powerful military nations in Europe saying we got nothing. We couldn't get in the fight if we wanted to. If we had to defend ourselves, we couldn't get in the fight. That ain't no way to be able to take on the Russians. So right now, people who are concerned about NATO coming in, or that only means the U.S., they don't have what they need to do it. They don't have what they need to go in if they wanted to. So they can talk a good game, but they don't have it. And they don't have the political wherewithal. They don't have the political backing and the political strength to do it. I don't see NATO coming in. I don't see how that happened, particularly when we look at the Russian patience. The other thing that it's done is it's demilitarized NATO by setting up, taking their time and moving slow. For those who are saying there's something wrong with the Russians, they're not moving fast. Here's what I'm saying. If what you're doing is working, why would you change that? The Russians are sitting back there, and NATO's like, we're sending some more howitzers and they blow them up. We're sending some more tanks, they blow them up. They send some more whatever, they blow them up. They don't have to fight NATO. They're fighting NATO's gear. But luckily for them, and fortunately for Russia, NATO has decided to take their finest gear and stick it in the hands of people that don't know how to use it with no air cover. Blow it. NATO might as well blow that shit up themselves, because they're making it easy for the Russians. And then some of the stuff they run right into a minefield. So I mean, if all I got to do is set up a minefield and you're going to drive your equipment right out in it, if I'm Russia, I'm doing that for a while until you decide you don't want to do it anymore. If I'm Russia, as long as you want to continue to do that, hey, you're going to run out of stuff before I run out of TNT to blow this stuff up with. So NATO is committing military suicide by simply um, putting their stuff into a position to allow the Russians to destroy it, to blow it up. So the Russians right now are in a position where they can continue to work on diplomatic, economic, and other aspects of the confrontation. And they can kind of sit, they don't have to fight NATO. They have their military potential behind the lines, sitting back, hundreds of thousands of men. They're pretty much entire Air Force, they're pretty much their entire Navy. They've got all of their military potential in case they're attacked by NATO, which is NATO's other problem. You set up a proxy war on their border in an area that makes it easy for them. They don't have to have long lines of supplies, and they don't have to put forth a lot of effort to keep this fight going. People think that Russia's losing or they're struggling or whatever. They're not using a lot of the level of military potential that would cripple them in the event that they were to be attacked by NATO. And NATO doesn't have a lot of military potential. They got U.S. Bases with fighters and things like that. But if they got in the air and they went against Russia, since they're on Russia's border, they would lose most of those bases and airfields in the first hours of a conflict. In hours of a conflict with Russia, simply from long-term missile strikes, they would lose so much. And Russia has missiles that they can't defend, which are against. So they would have problems losing. They couldn't losing a lot of stuff if they went against a Russian. They know it. They couldn't bring any of their ships within 1,700 kilometers of the Russians, maximum, because the Kinzhal missiles, they can't defend against them, and anything they put in the air is going to get struck at least once by Kinzhal missile, and that's going to be problematic for an aircraft carrier or any type of ship. So going into this next NATO meeting, I don't see that NATO's jumping in this thing anytime soon. I don't see that they can. Could be wrong, but I don't think so. So what happens here? Well, all NATO has now is propaganda. That's what there's a reason that when they overthrew the government and they had Yatsenyuk in and they decided to go with somebody new, there's a reason that they decided to go with an actor, because they needed somebody who was a fraud. They needed somebody who didn't really care about the truth, but who would be pretty good at sounding like they were telling the truth when they put forth the narrative. And that's all they got left now. So they're sitting there. What are they going to do? The truth is, the only thing they can do is continue to do this human sacrifice thing with the Ukrainians. And at some point, here's my prediction: Ukraine's going to turn on them at some point. The time will come when the overwhelming sentiment in Ukraine will be, we've been used. I think it's already starting. I don't know how big it is. I understand that a lot of Ukrainians are really afraid of their state, afraid of an oppressive totalitarian state, that they'll be put down so they can't push back. It's kind of like they're being held hostage by their quisling government. So that's a problem. But at some point, I think Ukraine is going to push back and they're going to mutiny. And I do think that the time is coming for a mutiny in Europe. We've heard some rumblings. We've heard Macron for years say that, well, how come we don't have a EU army? We don't have our own military. We don't have our own thing going on here. And it is, as I've said, the Europeans recognize, I think, that their not only do their security needs not align with the neocons in the U.S., but they are antithetical to the aspirations, the hegemonic aspirations of the neocons in the U.S. That they're simply being used. That they maybe haven't realized yet that the neocons see them as a threat in the same way that they see any rising power or any current economic power as a threat. But they're slowly but surely learning. But the bottom line is, going into Vilnius, I think the U.S. empire is going to try to work as hard as they can. Their big battle there is going to be to maintain the narrative that there's going to be some countries there saying we got to do something, we got to make a move. When can we start um, having a discussion about how to end this thing, however, they're talking to the Russians. That kind of stuff is going to be going on, right? But the US's focus is going to be to maintain power over their vassals, to keep everyone online with the narrative, maintain the narrative, and just drag this thing on and keep this thing going and hold it together. That's the bottom line. Hold it together. How do we hold this thing together? Because they know it's coming apart. And the issue now is not whether they can hold it together, because they can. The issue is how long they can hold it together. I think France is an indicator to a lot of countries. I think a lot of countries in Europe are looking at France, recognizing that, and the issue of recognizing that brings up the issue of what's going on in France, of unrest within Europe, that they have. Look, a country is a coalition, a party is a coalition, groups are coalitions, right? So if you got France is a coalition. You got white French people, you've got people who have come over recently as immigrants, you have people whose parents and grandparents came over from countries that were colonized and oftentimes oppressed and genocided by France, who have some generational angst against the French colonialism. You got a lot of things going on in France, and in that, European countries, through their colonial aspirations, basically, screwed up a lot of countries, in the Middle East and Africa, and those people are over there. They created a dynamic where a lot of people left those countries that they had blown to hell and overthrown, and came to Europe, and the Europeans then were like, "Hey, great! It looks like the oligarchs were like, hey, hooray! This is wonderful. We've got some cheap labor that we can use to displace the indigenous labor of the Frenchmen and Germans, etc. That's going to work for us." So they could blow up the countries, they could destabilize these countries, and they could get some fresh, cheap labor over here. They were happy. Right. And meanwhile, the Europeans so let me say this about you guys. Sometimes you guys can be a bit of knuckleheads, love you. Instead of looking at the oligarchs who were destabilizing countries and bringing over cheap labor, the Europeans got mad at the cheap labor. They got mad at the immigrant who comes over here, not the person who blew his country up. You know what that reminds me of? I always say, sometimes on Twitter, I'll tweet something and a person will get caught up in the word. They don't see the whole tweet. They'll get caught up in a word in the tweet. And I'll say, it's like pointing for a dog. You ever notice that? You got a dog and you point to something. They look at your finger. You're pointing, look over there, Rex, look. And they're just looking at your finger. They don't understand the concept that finger represents something they should do. They look at your finger. They don't look at that you're pointing at something. There's a mountain lion running towards us. Look, Rex, hey, that's a nice finger. You want me to look at your finger? I'll lick your finger. That's the way dogs think. And that's the way I see the Europeans and Americans also, when they look at their border, they say, look at all these stinking immigrants. And I'm like, there's a reason we just bombed the crap out of their country and overthrew that. We just destabilized Syria, and 2 million Syrians showed up at our border. Do you think maybe there's a connection? And the Europeans are like, those darn Syrians. I'm like, oh, it's like pointing, and they're looking at your stinking finger. Are they dogs? For God's sake, people, wake up. These oligarchs have done something to bring cheap labor to replace your job, and you get mad at the cheap labor, not at the oligarchs who created the dynamic to replace your job. The oligarchs moved your factory, closed it down, and moved it to China so that they could get cheap labor, and you get mad at the Chinese. You're looking at my finger. It's pointing to something, you idiot. That's the way I feel about Europeans and Americans sometimes when it comes to understanding the dynamics related to immigration and cheap labor. I say all that to say this. There is instability. I was going somewhere with that. All of these things create a level of internal instability. The austerity that's forced upon these countries. Hey, guess what? We got to now spend 2% of our GDP buying bombs from the Americans, which is less money to fund the pensions. So we're going to move our pensions back for 2 years, and the people in France are going to get pissed. We're going to take some of the things that hardworking Europeans and Americans have earned, have voted for, have gotten accustomed to over the years, have every right to as a member, as a citizen of that country. They've earned that stuff. right? And now you're going to take that from them because you got to spend more of your money on budgets, on the budget, handing money to the military industrial complex in the US and corruption in the EU, right? So there's internal instability. As a result, as NATO goes further and further away from the needs and the security needs of Europe, it's no longer a country, and they can no longer, NATO can no longer even make the argument that it's there to protect the Europeans from attack by the Russians, to secure the Europeans. It is now clearly an aggressive military organization that is focusing its aggression on Russia and China as a result of the US. And what is it? Is it a coincidence that the US says we're focusing all of our aggression on Russia and China? What about you, NATO? Yeah, we're focusing all of our aggression on NATO, on Russia, excuse me, on Russia and China too, coincidentally. Not that we're a puppet organization for the United States, but they are. So someone says, out in, yes, dogs can follow where we point. I'm not saying it doesn't happen on the occasion, but it ain't the rule. Most of the time, you may find a dog every now and then that can, but or more often than not, dogs are going to look at your fingers. And as I said, this wasn't about dogs. This was about Americans and Europeans when it comes to understanding the dynamics of their jobs being replaced by cheap labor, by their oligarchs, and not getting pissed at the oligarchs, getting pissed at the cheap labor, right? Your jobs being moved to China, not getting mad at the people that moved the job to China, but getting mad at the Chinese, right? That's the concept I'm getting at. So this ain't about dogs pointing, if you get the picture. I wouldn't want to get caught up in the discussion about the words I'm using when there's a philosophical foundational point here I'm trying to make, which ironically kind of spins us back into that whole thing, doesn't it? That let's not get caught up in the pointing. Let's talk about the foundational value of what we're discussing in the first place. All right, let's continue. So I say all that to say this. When it comes to NATO, no buy-in and no support from Europe, no NATO. And the buy-in and support from Europe is dying. And the nationalist parties in Europe, if you look at it, the traditional nationalist parties in Europe are I think, poised to have considerably more power in the European governance. And when I say traditional nationalism, there's different types of nationalism. When somebody says nationalism, when someone says liberalism, socialism, conservatism, that doesn't mean anything until you explain what kind. When somebody says a dog, are you talking about a Chihuahua? Are you talking about a Mastiff? When somebody says a bird. So when you say socialism, capitalism, I always make this point. You must understand that there's different strains of various political ideologies. So when you look at the nationalism that I believe is going to take place in Europe, it is similar to, don't get me wrong, it is a right-wing nationalism, but it's also a nationalism that says, look, we love our country and we want to look out for our country and take care of our country. First and foremost, everything we should do should be taking care of us, right? There's also a nationalism that aligns with globalism. It's like the ultra nationalism in Ukraine, right? The ultra nationalism in Ukraine is a global nationalism. The Nazi nationalism is a global nationalism, right? That's why they align so well with the globalists. The globalists say, we want to run the entire country. I mean, the entire world, right? The Nazis in Europe, in Ukraine, what have they said? We want to lead the white race throughout the world. That is a globalist, ultra nationalist, but it's globalist. We want to run the whole world. The kind of nationalism that I'm talking about, go to South America. I go to countries in South America, and there's a nationalism there. It's a socialism. It's a lefty, but it's a nationalism that says, I love my country of Venezuela. And you should love yours too, but I love mine. And I'm going to look out for my country. It's not one that's aggressive towards other countries. It's not a nationalism that says, I love my country and we need to take over your country and make yours just like mine. There's a big, strong strain of US nationalism that's an imperialist nationalism. I love my country and it's the best. Therefore, we must import my culture over to your country and you must live just like me. You don't have a rainbow flag. Well, you got to have one like us. Or you don't do what we do or eat what we eat or think what we think or worship like we worship, and you have to do that. That's a globalist version of a nationalism, as opposed to the strain of nationalism that I think is bound to rise in Europe. I'm a lefty, so it's not going to align with me, but here's the reality of it. It can't be worse off. The Europeans can't be worse off with the leadership that they'll have in the future than they have now. I don't see how, because they're being dragged down the path of economic and military hell. Um, but I look at it, the kind of nationalism that I think will arise will be the one that says we're looking out for Greece, we're looking out for France, we're looking out for Germany. We ain't looking out. We're not joining in with the U.S., and we're not going to be vassals to anybody. That's an independent, a sovereign strain of nationalism. I'm not endorsing it, and I'm not endorsing it. It doesn't matter what I think. I'm just saying that's what I think is going to arise in Europe as a, for every, what is it? Paul Robeson Jr. used to say, for every revolution, there's a counter revolution, right? I think there will be a counter revolutionary forces. I can use that term, to U.S. imperialism in Europe, as they feel the brunt, as they feel the pain of U.S. imperialism on them. There will be a counter revolution to that, where there will be a rise of political powers that say we want independence and sovereignty. And as a result of that, maybe there'll be a waking up of the old left in Europe. You know, right now there's something that has supplanted what was left. This we'll call it a neoliberalism, where instead of saying that leftism is what the Garland Nixon kind of left, the Garland Nixon kind of left says, look, all of working class people should stick together because we have an economic alignment. We all have the same needs. You may be a right winger, you may be disagree with me on all kinds of things, but you know, we all have 2.5 kids in a minivan or whatever. You know, we need a decent education. We need a decent job. We need decent benefits. We need to be able to retire. We need a safe community. We need certain things. We all need these things. And it doesn't matter if we agree on other things. There's certain things that we need. We have an economic alignment. And if somebody's in another country, that's just a regular working class person, and that person has the same needs. And why don't people who are working class people around the world align themselves so we can get along peacefully and we can attend to the needs of our economic class? That's the way I see leftism, right? However, this new strain that has supplanted leftism, particularly in the West, is, hey, we're number one, we're going to oppose all the things the traditional left believed in when it comes to trade unions and things like that. And what we're going to stand up for is the, some cultural issues, be it the trans issue or whatever, right? So we're going to now take a few cultural issues that may not be all that popular, and particularly in traditional communities around the world and traditional nations that have more traditional cultural values, and we're going to define left by whether or not you agree with this particular issue. I think that thing that has supplanted leftism is doomed. It's doomed to failure. It's doomed to failure because it's not going to be accepted by enough people. And there is a traditional left there that still is going to push its agenda. Someone said confusing nonsense versus empathy. Right? Yeah, it's lies and stuff like that, where people in the neocons and the neoliberals cannot really tell you what they're doing and why they do it. So they give you a bunch of cute, confusing nonsense and crazy making. So what we're looking at now is, as reality starts to assert itself in Europe when it comes to the economic woes of the people and the anger and the instability due to immigration issues, due to foreign policy that has destabilized other parts of the world, due to oligarchs wishing to supplant the working class with cheaper labor, all of those internal divisions are going to start to arise more and make it more difficult for the ruling elite to keep the people in order, to keep the people with their mouths shut, and to say, just get in the military so you can go around the world and die on some foreign land like we tell you to do. That's going to get more and more difficult. And as that happens, it's not that NATO is, you're going to wake up one day and NATO is going to disappear. It's going to crumble. What things happens, it's going to, as the foundation of NATO, which has been exposed, right? The foundation of NATO is we're here to defend Europe and to protect Europe. As that is exposed, that NATO is exactly the opposite, that NATO is not an organization to defend Europe. It is a prison to keep Europe in line, right? You're not a member of NATO. You are a captive of NATO in Europe. You are a prisoner of the U.S. empire, and NATO is the bars. NATO is the leaders of NATO, the Stoltenberg, the EU leaders, the Baerbocks and the and the what are they? The Vonderlands. These are the capos, right? These are the people who pretend to be part of your group, but they're not. They're just there to benefit for themselves and to sell you down the to sell you down the river so they can benefit. And people are waking up to that. And as that happens, NATO doesn't just blow up one day. I think NATO starts to fall apart. One of the big countries, be it France, Germany, one of these big countries is going to fall off the wagon. It's going to say, look, we ain't doing this. As they start to say no, as they start to say to more and more to the US, no. Keep an eye on this summit. I think something big is going to happen at the summit. One of the countries is going to say no. Something's going to come out of this summit that gives us another indicator of the of how unhealthy NATO is. NATO's doomed. It's doomed. It's doomed. And the reason it's doomed is because the reality of it has been exposed. As long as NATO could make the argument that they were there to bring, remember what the EU said? We're going to bring peace and prosperity to Europe. How's that working out? NATO, we're going to defend it and we're going to keep Europe peaceful. How's that working out? The problem is that the narrative behind NATO and the EU both are being exposed, that they're nothing but umbrella organizations to keep the Europeans in line. And then when it's time to sacrifice the Europeans, NATO is the gallows that they'll be marched up on and hung. And that reality is coming out. And so there's no way I see that NATO survives this. I ain't saying it's going to be gone overnight, just like the US dollar. I'm not saying it's going to be gone overnight, but I'm saying that the signs are there. As I've used this over and over again. I've used this analogy over and over again. If we're playing chess and we both look at the board and say 3 moves and it's checkmate, there ain't no way around that. I move here, you move there, I move there, you move here, checkmate. And both of us see it. That game of chess is over. When the outcome is inevitable, the game is over. That's why I say the outcome now is inevitable for NATO. The US can't go. They've set up they put themselves in a position where they can't possibly go negotiate a deal with the Russians. No way. They can't possibly do that. There's no way out for them. There's no way out. They cannot, Ukraine cannot win this fight. The US can't negotiate a deal. Number one, they can't negotiate a deal because the Russians don't trust them, and you need trust for a deal. And because any deal that they negotiated would thwart the whole neocon plan to run the world, they've painted themselves in a corner. They put all their eggs in one basket, and guess what? That basket is flopped. And so there's no way out for them. There's no way for NATO to survive. It's over. So that's my position. NATO is dead. Watch this summit. I think something big comes out of the summit. I think there's people going into this summit. I may be wrong. So let's go with 2 possibilities on the summit, since I don't want to just say there's just one. Possibility 1. You go to the summit and all the countries go and they reluctantly sing a NATO song. Hey, what do you think, France? Yeah, I'm still with NATO. We're going forward. The Russians are going to lose. They're fighting with shovels, blah, blah, blah. Next. Hey, what do you think, Schultz? Yeah, what he said. Oh, hey, we got the people from Italy. Maloney, what do you got to say? Russians fighting with shovels, washing machines, whatever the hell. Yeah, I'm still in. And you just get a bunch of countries that reluctantly says that, okay, we're in, but we're unhappy, but reluctantly we say we're in, and you maintain the narrative, if nothing else, and that's it. The other possibility, I think, is, interesting to see this, the other possibility is that you have a block of countries that are really unhappy, and somebody, be it the Hungarians, the Austrians, I don't know, let's just say the Hungarians, speak up for a bunch of blocks of countries and says, look, we ain't down with this. This is screwed up, and we want out. We want out now. We want this thing is over. We want to go back to cheap energy. We don't like this. And maybe Hungary or whoever says, and I'm not just speaking for myself, and the US looks around and says, you believe this idiot? You believe what the Hungarians said? This is crazy. And the other countries are like, well, I mean, you kind of have a point. I mean, maybe we should listen to the Hungarians. I mean, maybe we should just think about what they're saying, which would indicate that they all sat in the back room and said to the Hungarians, we're down with you. Please speak up. We can't do it, because they want to. So I think there's one or two possibilities. Possibility one, I'm going to put those forward, is they all just say, sing the narrative and leave with their tails between their legs. The other possibility is that we see some real pushback, that the Hungarians or somebody speaks for a block of countries and says, we want the hell out. We're sick and tired of this. How do we get out? Let's watch this. I don't think that there will be a, sort of, and if there's part one where they just maintain the narrative, then in that instance, they'll just, parrot the usual crap. We've got to fight for as long as we can. We got to stand up. The Russians can't possibly win. The Russians have to lose, because if they do, democracy will fall, blah, 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 blah. The narrative is maintained, and they just try to hold on as long as they can. And this is possible, that the U.S. is able to whip these people into the narrative discipline, and they just leave basically saying, let's continue to try to hold on as long as we can. But God, winter's coming, and we better hope this is a warm one, right? That's possibility one. And the other one is a range, a continuum of things where somebody like Hungary speaks for the bloc, or you get a loud roar where a bunch of countries are like, hey, we went out of this. We went out. This is not working out for us. But this is a big summit to watch. And I think right now, I think the Russians, particularly people are like, why won't the Russians do a big offensive or something like that? I think whatever the Russians are going to do next, if anything, they're waiting until after the summit. Because if you're the Russians, you're like, I don't want to give them anything to go into the summit and say, look what the Russians are doing, or look what the Russians did, or whatever. We've got to do X. I think you're looking more at the Russians kind of coasting into the summit, watching it, waiting. Are they going to do something stupid? Are they going to come out of here and say, yes, we're doing a no-fly zone, and then they're going to have to, the Russians are going to have to act in a particular way to respond to that. So I think they're, again, in a chess game, sometimes you move offensively, sometimes you just make a move and you watch your opponent. Sometimes you want to counterpunch, see what your opponent's going to do. Wait, hope they make a mistake. Watch for their errors. Look for openings, right? I think the Russians is going to do that leading into the NATO meeting. They're just going to lay there, look for openings, keep their counterpunching going on, keep moving aggressively, keep the pressure on the Ukrainian military. Do a heavy defense on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Lots and lots of air defense there, lots and lots of defense to make sure nothing big happens there, to protect that as best they can, and wait to see the outcome. I think they got a plan too. Because this is the way I'd be thinking. If in fact they move in this direction after the NATO summit, I'll do this more aggressively or whatever. If they do that, I think they got a series of plans that based on what happens. Afterwards, I think they also have a plan for what happens if the NATO makes any attempt at a peace negotiation, because they already know where they're coming from. And I think the Russians are simply going to hand them a copy of the document that they came up with in December of 2021 that says these are our demands for border security, and say, hey, remember this document? Here it is. Peruse it. Remember before the war, and we said we can talk about this document and there won't have to be a war, and you said no. Yeah, well, here's the same document. You got the same decision to make. I think that the Russians are prepared to do that, and they're only willing to negotiate on things that they can walk away with right now. The old money in hand. I'm only going to do a deal with you that puts money in my hand. I'm not going to do a deal with you that says you'll put money in my hand later. If you want to buy this for $1,000, I need that 1,000 in my hand right now. So the only way that the NATO countries can navigate can negotiate with the Russians is the Russians are going to say, I'll take what I can get right now. Anything that you give, that you expect from me, has to be immediate reciprocal, right? You do this, I'll do that. You do this, I'll do that. None of this, if you do this at some time in the future, I'll do that. I think that's the way if I were negotiating for the Russians, or if I was negotiating, if the NATO called me and said, Garland, we need you to negotiate with the Russians, I'd say, I have to have something concrete that we can do now. And I would have to go to the Russians and say, we want to negotiate. And the Russians would say, you can kiss my ass. I'd say, well, here's what we're willing to do. Let's start here. We would like you to do this, but here's what we're going to do. We'll do this if within 48 hours you'll do that. Because you gotta concretely hand them something, because they're not going to trust that you're going to do anything in the future. That's any negotiations with the Russians are going to have to be, that's what I call them, money in hand. That's what my dad used to call them, money in hand negotiations. Let's do these concrete things now. Any idea, any thought that you can tell the Russians one of these old days, I'm going to do this if you do that, yeah, you can forget that. So I think, and of course, the reality that ultimately the security needs of the Europeans does not in any way, shape, or fashion align with the desired outcome of the neocons. Let me put it like this: the neocons in DC and the Europeans do not have any alignment in security needs. That also implies that sooner or later NATO was going to die anyway. That implies that. So let's keep an eye out. But bottom line is, NATO's dead. I think what will eventually happen too is this: NATO will be alive in rhetoric and dead in reality, right? I mean, what happens if big countries drop out? What happens if a bunch of countries say we're not going to give you 2% of our GDP in military anymore? We're not going to go along with these escapades around military colonial escapades around the world. You can still have meetings. You can still say we're part of NATO, but if NATO's not doing anything and the people in NATO aren't willing to follow the edicts of the United States, then you don't have NATO. So you could have something that looks, sounds, and smells like NATO, but it has no teeth, and that it won't really act in any way, and that the people are not united to do anything. So NATO's done. NATO's finished. As far as being a military alliance, and really, right now, think about this. I got to say this: if it's a military alliance that's supposedly fighting Russia, and they can't put together 50,000 to 100,000 troops right now to fight Russia, to defend themselves from Russia, to attack Russia, right? If it's a military alliance and Russia is the adversary, and you right now can't put together the military potential that you need to go up against Russia, that the only thing you could end up doing was committing suicide, sticking a gun in your mouth and starting a nuclear war, that's all you could do. Well, that's not a military alliance, is it? That's a suicide pact. That's Jonestown. That's all they've got left. What happens if we have to fight Russia? We'll commit suicide. We'll fire nukes. They'll fire nukes and we'll all die. That's not defense. Remember, to defend yourself means you go home at the end of the night, right? So to defend yourself means everybody survives. If your only option is a nuclear war and you all die, that ain't defense. So, it is what it is. But I think based on all of the things that I've said, you may end up with something that looks and smells like NATO. But if NATO is to be defined as a military alliance, I don't see how it survives. And is it even alive now? It's a military alliance. The UK says we got 40 tanks and 25,000 troops. Russia says we've only got like 6 big guns left. We've given the rest of Ukraine and they've been blown to hell. Germany says we don't have the military wherewithal to protect our borders if we needed to. If that is in fact the case right now, that the major countries, France, people are running around the streets, the place is on fire and it looks like World War Z. It looks like, Dawn of the Dead, for God's sake. If France is falling apart, if Germany and the UK don't have the things they need, the economic potential and wherewithal to protect themselves, you have to ask the question, is NATO even still alive right now as a military alliance? I would argue not. So at any rate, thanks a lot, you guys. As I said, I'm in my office and I snuck into the conference room so that I could chat with you guys, but I got to get running. But I certainly appreciate everyone taking out their time. Don't forget, if you get an opportunity, if you can, buymeacoffee.com is a great place to contribute to the channel. And you can go on buymeacoffee.com. It can do it'll say buy Garland a coffee for $5. It's buymeacoffee.com/Garland NH. I don't know what the hell this other H in there. You can do just buy me a coffee, or you can say, I want to be a monthly subscriber or whatever the hell you call it at Buy Me a Coffee. And you can do that $5 or whatever monthly, just like Patreon. Of course, then there's patreon.com, PayPal. And of course, I've got my Cash App. So anyone who can, who has the economic wherewithal to donate to the channel and chooses to, thank you very much. Don't forget, rockfin.com/Garland Nixon is my alternative platform. It is a censorship-free platform. So if they throw me off YouTube or they censor some of my videos, you go over to rockfin.com/Garland Nixon, become a member, and you can still see me there. Please go there and become a member, just in case they throw me off or whatever. You've got a place that you can see everything. If you can't afford it, you can become become subscribed over Rockfin. It's like $14.99 a month or $12 something a month if you sign up for you. If you can afford it, I certainly appreciate that. If not, thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day. Peace. I'm out.